Hello, this is Books in the World. I'm Dr. Robert Reese, and I want to say that the Books in the World is a cable television that's been in existence as a book interview since 43 years ago. So it's the oldest running cable TV book review in the country. It's sponsored by the Cape Cod Writer Center, and the Cape Cod Writer Center also has a conference which I want to plug, because between the dates of August 4th and 7th, we're having a virtual conference, and we hope that you'll go to capecodwriters.com and look for the information about that. Today I'm really pleased and honored to have Rich Marcello here. Rich is an author of several books. Today we're going to talk about his most recent book, Cenotaphs. And Rich, welcome to Books in the World. We really have looking forward to this all week.
Well, thanks, Bob, for having me.
One review calls this book, Cenotaphs, an achingly poignant tale of love and loss. And another, Cenotaphs is a beautiful, timely, powerful novel. I read it slowly, savoring each scene. Its elegance, intelligence, poignancy, and humanity remind me of Anthony Doerr's, of All the Light We Cannot See. And I think that's really high praise, to think that you're being compared to Anthony Doerr's. I love that book. Mm-hmm. And I liked this book a lot. I really love this book. Before we talk about the book, let's talk about you for a minute.
Okay.
And tell us a little bit about your background.
So I spent most of my career in high technology, and so I was running large server groups, software groups, and I did that for about 30 years or so. Toward the end, I was managing around 5,000 people and running about a $3 or $4 billion a year business. And because of all of that, I was lucky enough to be able to retire early from technology and then basically go into writing full time, which I've been doing for the last 11 years. So I'd always wanted to do that. I was a songwriter when I was younger. I was a poet when I was younger. And I could do those things in kind of fits and starts while I was still working in technology. But if you're going to go write novels, you really need to do it full time. And so I decided I wanted to do that for the rest of my life. And around 2010, 11 is when I basically started doing that.
That's pretty amazing background. When you go from people, 5,000 people,
yeah, I had quite a few.
To a solitary life as a writer, that is an amazing transformation.
Yeah, it took a little while, to really get into it. I didn't know what I didn't know, but I think after the second or third book, I really kind of hit full stride.
Yeah, it is really interesting how being a physician and then going into writing afterwards, it really is an amazing learning curve that you start on, and you don't know what you don't know, as you say.
Absolutely.
So you started writing about how long ago? How many years ago?
About 11 years ago.
About 11 years ago.
Yeah, and I do that full time, so I basically write in the mornings for 6 or 7 hours a day, and I do that 7 days a week. So I'm very, very disciplined in terms of doing that. And then I spend a good 2 years or so on each of my books. So during the course of this 11 years, this is my 5th novel.
Yes.
And then I also put out a book of poetry, and I just finished the first draft of a new novel, which we can talk about later.
Okay, yeah, I see you're working not only on one novel, but two novels.
That's true,
right? Yeah. I belong to a bunch of old men who meet at a place like Joy's. Joy's is in the book. Joy's is a place that the protagonist, Ben, in this novel, he meets all of his old buddies in Joy's diner, and they trade stories. And I belong to a group like that, and we call everybody calls these groups Romeos, retired old men eating out.
Yeah.
And this novel really resonated with me because it's so familiar. I mean, this kind of reaction to each other and the relationships that these men have is really interesting. Did a group like this inspire this?
I would say many groups like this, right? So I have a group of my own where we meet at this place called the Press Cafe, pretty much on a, maybe 3-4 times a week and do many of the things that are described in the book. But when I was doing the research for the book, I found many men's groups across pretty much the entire country who were doing similar things. And so I thought it was a universal way to kind of set up the story.
Yeah, it certainly is. And one of the things that I'm impressed by is how much truth there is in what you wrote about these groups and how they get along with each other. The characters. This is what makes the book, I think. The characters are definitely, the characters are recognizable. We know them from the beginning and they're real. The names are Ben, Sam, Scott, and Zeke, the rescue dog. Even the cabin where Ben lives is a character, because there are all kinds of things you describe in the book about this cabin. It's kind of a mess until Sam comes along and helps straighten it up. Can you read the opening paragraph about Ben?
Sure, I can. I'll need to put my glasses on, but I can definitely read it.
Here, I have it outlined there.
Okay, great.
This impressed me. This is what hooked me from the very first page.
Okay, I am old now. I hoped I would have figured out a few answers by this point, but the truth is I spend more time each day watching the Red Sox than thinking about such things. In the summer and fall, the games are on every day, often twice a day, and watching them gives Zeke and me something to do. Something zen exists about the game, something appealing to me as I age. Something about the stillness, the waiting, the bursts of energy, all mimicking the best and worst times in life. And I like the red, blue, and gray uniforms. They remind me of a more structured time.
That's beautiful. It really captures this, and it's really timely also, since the Major League Baseball has
settled.
They're going to have a season, which warms the cockles of my heart.
Yeah, me too.
Page 10.
Okay.
The one that starts out, I still drive. I like that too. Again, it tells you something about Ben himself, and it's sort of a continuation of the first one that you read.
Okay. Here we go. I still drive. I have an old 2002 pickup purchased at auction for $960. It runs pretty well. I take it to town for supplies, home repair stuff, too many expensive prescriptions, $15 30-packs of Budweiser, those sort of things. Sometimes I take it to breakfast with the other old men in town. I love them like brothers. We talk about their families, about politics, about sports, football lately. Of them all, Scott and I are closest.
Yeah, that sort of sets it up.
It sets it
up.
up.
So was Ben himself someone you knew or inspired by someone you knew?
Yeah, no, not really. I tend to build characters from fragments. So only once in all of my novels have I actually taken a real scene out of life. Instead, I tend to I'll see a little piece there, and then I'll put it together. And I'm a big believer in kind of creating characters in dream time. So I'll kind of wake up in the morning. I tend to write very, very early. And at 5 o'clock in the morning, I have my own writing studio in my house, basically. And I'll go into that, and that's kind of where Ben came from. Samantha as well. So, and so over time, as you write, the character emerges, and then you really get his or her voice. And then from there, they take on a life of their own.
Well, Ben certainly does take on a life of his own, as does Sam. At first, I didn't really like Samantha.
Yeah.
She is brassy and sort of intrusive. She sort of charges into the group of men sitting in the restaurant and sits down and takes charge. And I thought, I don't think I'm going to like this woman. But, and she was very angry too. She was very angry about everything. A hedge fund operator, I think she was. And so I was prepared not to like her at first, but she grew on me, especially after I understood the trauma that she'd been through. Would you like to talk about that trauma?
Well, I think what I'll say is that for both of them, they basically have been unable to forgive themselves. And so the story, in a way, is about forgiveness and about redemption and about being able to do that with the help of another person in a very unexpected way. And so rather than talk specifically about the trauma, because each of them has a trauma and they've been unable to forgive themselves for it, I think it's that idea of two very different people on the surface coming together in a random way, totally unexpected way, and falling in love, not romantically, but platonically.
Yeah.
And I think in fiction, it's very rare that you actually see characters who exhibit platonic love, especially between a man and a woman, right? And I think I wanted to explore that idea, and I wanted to explore that idea in the context of redemption and forgiveness and this notion of a pretty large trauma that affected both of them in different ways earlier in their life.
Yeah, and you do that in a very subtle way, and it comes out gradually over the course of the novel. And you, as a reader, you don't realize what's happening as you're being drawn into this story.
Yeah. I will say one more thing about Samantha, though, which is that the intent was for people to not like her too much in the beginning, right? So
you got that one.
I got that one right. So, and yet in the beginning, while all of that stuff is happening, there's one moment where she's quite vulnerable unexpectedly when she goes to visit Ben in the cabin, and so I think that sets up some of what's to come later in the book. But I wanted her arc to go from that place where people would say, "Who is this woman, and what's this all about?" to a much different place toward the end of the book.
Yeah, well, she, as I say, she grew on me, and you can't help but like her toward the end of the book.
Yeah.
And this is maybe a little touchy, and maybe you don't want to talk about this.
Yeah.
Where is Foundland, Connecticut?
Yeah, so I think some readers will equate Foundland, Connecticut to another town in Connecticut, but really I made it fictitious on purpose. I wanted it to be representative of any town in America. And I think, you know, when you read through the book and you understand what happened, you realize that basically it could be any town in America. And so I think I don't want to give away any more than that at this point in time.
Right.
I just think that I thought about making it a real town, and I decided to make it a fictional town because I wanted it to generalize a little bit more.
Yeah, well, it's really very moving what happens in Foundland. You say you usually takes about 2 years to develop a novel, and do you plot out a story before you begin?
No,
or do you just
I'm not a
let it happen?
plotter. I just let it happen, yeah. So I definitely will let the first pass just come, and I kind of get an idea. Sometimes it's a first sentence. Like in this particular book, that first paragraph of the book came before anything else. And so from that first paragraph, I was able to kind of keep going. And, you know, I change things after the first pass. I want to make sure everything ties together and is integrated and that there really is an arc to the overall story. But through the first pass, I just kind of let whatever creative juices I have kind of flow, and I just kind of see where the story takes me.
That's really interesting, because I think there are two schools at
There are,
least
yeah.
that do this, and there are those that use storyboards and or they plot the whole thing out. One of the teachers at one of the conferences we've had said you definitely have to plot it all out. You have to know where you're going to go at the end of the story. In fact, some people like to even write the last chapter before they write the first chapter, and he went on in this vein. I think that it all depends on the way your mind works, as
that's true.
to how that works out.
I will say that I typically do figure out the ending of the book, though I'm not sure how I'm going to necessarily get to the ending, but I kind of know how it's going to end. And if I were going to kind of answer the question in two parts, I would say for the first draft of a book, I never plot. But for the second and third and however many drafts there are, I spend more time thinking about the plot and making sure that it all ties together, though I don't get to the point where I actually outline anything.
It always brings to mind Hemingway's famous story about the first draft is you know what.
I know what, yeah. I actually believe that. I think that's definitely true.
Right. Talk a little bit about the use, Ben's use of photos to flashback. I think he has a lot of photos in his cabin, and you use that in a very deft way, I think, to talk about the past.
Well, I think in both cases, as I said earlier, the characters are unable to forgive themselves, and they're living in many ways in the past. Right? They've been unable to get over the events of the past. And so all of those photos on the wall, he no longer has relationships with many of those people. Some he still does, but in general he does not. And so that was a way to actually kind of connect with his past and show the readers essentially where he came from and how he got to the point where the story starts, on page one. So, so I thought that was a nice way to kind of show it visually. I was thinking about it in terms of if I had a camera filming this, what would the camera see? And I thought having that wall of photos and then being able to kind of go off on any one of those photos and talk about it in more detail. Mary Ann, for example, in particular, was a really good way of doing that.
Yeah, it's also interesting to talk about the frames of the kind of wood that you selected for the frames of the photos. I thought that was an interesting touch. I had to look up the word cenotaph.
Cenotaph. Yeah.
Cenotaph. I still don't have it in my brain.
You're not alone there, by the way.
So I looked it up, and I know what it means. Would you like to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, in many of my books, I get the title very early, but in this book, I didn't get the title until the end. And one of the reasons is that as I kind of finished I think maybe it was the third draft of the book, I realized that there were many cenotaphs in the book. So you could say that Ben is an example of one. Samantha's an example of one. The photos you just mentioned are an example of one. The actual cenotaph that's built in the woods is another example of one. And so I realized that I was writing a story about many different kinds of cenotaphs, both in human form and in stone form, for example. And that seemed like that was the right title.
Yeah, it's a very interesting title, and it's catchy too. I mean, from a marketing standpoint, people are going to look at that and say,
they're going to say, what the heck is that?
Yeah, exactly. And I asked you this earlier before we started, who did the artwork and that wonderful picture on the cover? And I think covers are a whole area of books that we could talk about as a separate session. Yeah. But this one was particularly interesting. I kept looking at it and saying, what does it mean?
Yeah. Well, I think I was lucky enough with my publishing company to kind of agree up front that I would have a lot of input into the cover. And so in this particular case, I was able to find an artist and a piece of art that basically the direction that was given was I want something that kind of shows the state of Ben and Samantha at the start of the book, and it can be in very surreal or abstract terms. And so that's kind of what came back, and I was really, really happy with that. And the publishing company was really happy with it, and so they were able to take the photo and then just put all of the graphics around it, and kind of make it their own. But I think it's important to really have a cover reflect kind of the book in the right way. And I tend to like if you look at the covers of my other books, you will see that they have a surreal element to them as well. And so I tend to like that layer of abstraction on the covers.
Well, it really is a grabber. I mean, it really is good.
Thank you.
You mentioned that you're working on a couple of books now.
Yeah.
Would you like to say something about that?
Yeah, so I'm writing a book now called The Means of Keeping, and basically that's about the climate crisis. And so I've spent a lot of time, actually this last book has taken a little bit longer to write, probably is going to end up being 3 years when I'm done. I'm really researching what's going on with the climate crisis and then trying to put it into story form. And if you actually look at the number of novels out there right now on the climate crisis, there are not that many. There are some, right? But there are not that many. And I think it felt to me like it was time for me to kind of contribute in that area and to, basically write a story that hopefully will resonate with readers and make them more aware of what's happening in terms of the climate crisis. So that book will probably come out about a year from now, would be my guess. I think I'm going to take one more pass, and then I think once I finish this next pass, I'll hand it off to the publishing company. Might be 18 months, but 12 months to 18 months. So, and then the other book, I wrote a book called, before Cenotaphs, called The Latecomers. And The Latecomers is kind of about aging in America and about how, in general, how as we age in this country, there's folks tend to be devalued in many ways, or not necessarily recognized the way they were when they were younger. And so spent a lot of time on that book. Really liked the way that book turned out. It turned out the way I wrote that book, it could end up being, there could end up being 3 or 4 follow-on books if I choose to do them. And so the other book I'm working on, which is called In the Seat of the Eddas, is a follow-on to The Latecomers and continues on with that story about kind of aging in America.
Well, that's a huge topic now. As a pediatrician, I've never really understood aging until I got to be this age, and now I understand. All my friends are of this age, and it really is a completely different, surprising time of life, and all kinds of things can happen, as you know. Back to the climate change book, my wife and I saw Don't Look Up.
Yeah, I saw
recently,
that too.
And speaking of climate change, and the whole, most people have seen it, I'm sure by now, but it was really all an allegory about climate change.
It was,
and it really was an amazingly done thing. At first, I didn't like the movie very much, but as I got into it, I began to realize that this is an important movie.
Yeah.
So
I agree with you, actually. So I kind of had the same initial reaction, but I think the more I thought about it, the more I actually kind of warmed to it.
yeah.
My particular book is kind of in a different place than a lot of the dystopian fiction that's out there about the climate, or even a movie like this one. I'm trying to actually set it, I actually do set it 5 or 6 years in the future from now. And it's much more focused on what can still be done to actually turn the tide. And so in that sense, it's difficult because it's very difficult to make a change now, but at the same time, it's also hopeful. And there is a whole set of concrete things that could be done to kind of make things better.
We absolutely need a book of hope
Yeah.
when it comes to the climate change, because the only thing you hear are the dystopian versions of that we're all going to die kind of thing.
Yeah.
So you say you've been writing for about 11 years, did you say?
Yeah, I have been.
Yeah, and you were in artificial intelligence before that?
No, not artificial intelligence. That was actually Ben in the book, but
Oh,
I
okay.
was in technology though.
Okay,
So,
all right.
Yeah, so I did a lot of software engineering stuff and a lot of hardware engineering.
Well, you want to talk to one of our board members, Hugh Blair Smith, who is a computer guy, was involved in the space program, and he would have a lot of things to talk to you about, I'm sure.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
I think the one thing I did forget to mention now that I think about it is that, so I have been teaching at Seven Bridges Writers Collaborative for a while, and so I think just put a plug in for them. So I teach a fiction class there. I've been doing that for 6 or 7 years now, and then I teach an advanced fiction class there, and have really kind of enjoyed working with those folks. That's similar to, I think, what's happening here on the Cape, but it's really focused on central Massachusetts.
So what is Seven Bridges? I mean, it's like a Cape Cod Writers Center type
It is.
place?
So, there's critique groups available, so you'll get groups of 5 or 6 people together with an instructor, and they'll kind of read stuff and go through individual work. There are classes like my fiction class available. There are guest speakers who come in. There are sometimes authors who come in and do readings, things like that.
Oh, that sounds like a fascinating. And this is located in?
Think about it in terms of a writers group for Worcester County. So there are roughly close to 1 million people in Worcester County, and so it serves that group, just like Grub Street serves mostly the Boston area.
Yeah. Sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it's been a really good experience.
Do you have a website?
Yeah, there's a website there. So.
Do you know what it is?
I don't know off the top of my head, though.
I had a feeling you didn't know.
I can actually say one more thing about the book,
fine.
right, which
Okay.
is, so the other thing I was trying to do with Cenotaphs was write a book that had a different structure. And so in general, the way I wrote it is I had these kind of little fragmented chapters where you were pretty much in Ben's head, and you were getting different bits of his life through those fragments. And so those were all done mostly in narrative summary, sometimes in scene, but mostly in narrative summary. And then on the alternate chapters, I actually had Ben and Sam kind of change point of view, and those were all done in scenes. And so if you kind of think about the overall structure of the book, it's not like a traditional novel in terms of one scene after the other and an overall kind of consistent arc. It's that idea of fragments for a chapter followed by scenes and then telling the whole story that way, which, you know, I think is in general a unique way to tell a story, and I was quite happy with the way that turned out.
I think you should be. That was a very unique way. Do you call this first person central, or what? Is there a name for this?
It was just first person close.
Close, yeah.
Yeah, it was definitely
yeah.
first person close. Now, the other thing that I did here is I actually switched narrators basically and used first person close for both Ben and Sam.
Yes.
So that's a unusual thing to do.
Yeah.
But if you think about it, that works reasonably well in a love story, right? And even though this wasn't a romantic love story, it was a platonic love story. And so seeing it from both Ben's perspective and Sam's perspective was really important. And then I think later on in the book, there's a reason that becomes even clearer as to why I chose to use both first person for both of them.
Yeah, I was fascinated by that. I'm currently working on a book, first person peripheral, sort of like The Great Gatsby, you know, a Nick Carraway character talking about The Great Gatsby. And I'm finding it's an interesting exercise in craft. And it's one of those things that I'm kind of fond of now that I'm doing it. But it requires some messing around at the edges so that you don't say things that can't be said by the first person peripheral. And so it's an interesting device.
That is a really cool way to tell a story, I agree.
Yeah, I liked it a lot. Well, I think the only time that I had a little trouble with that one is when I was going to sleep toward the end, and I would forget to look at the caption at the top, and then I would say, "Well, who's talking right now?"
Right.
But that was my fault, not the fault of the writing. Okay, well, I want to thank you so much for coming all the way down here to the Cape. And,
thanks for having me.
Well, we were looking forward to it, and for good reason. And I really appreciate your being here.
Okay, thank you.
And I think people should run, don't walk, to the nearest bookstore and buy Cenotaph.